Modern Venice is one of the world's most beautiful cities. The Grand Canal, lined with Renaissance palaces, St. Mark's Basilica with its Byzantine domes, 17 million tourists each year photographing bridges, gondolas, and architectural masterpieces. But Venice didn't start this way. It wasn't planned. It wasn't chosen for its beauty. Venice was built by terrified refugees fleeing for their lives. In the 5th and 6th centuries AD, as the Roman Empire collapsed and barbarian armies swept through Italy, thousands of people fled to the most miserable, uninhabitable place they could find, a shallow lagoon of mudflats, salt marshes, and scattered sand islands on the northern Adriatic coast. They came because they were desperate. They stayed because no one else wanted this wretched swamp. And over 4 centuries, these refugees built something that shouldn't exist: a city on water, constructed on wooden pilings driven into mud, sustained by salt and fish, defended by the lagoon itself. This is the real story of how Venice began, not in glory, but in terror and survival. The collapse, why they fled, to understand why anyone would build a city on mudflats in a malarial lagoon. You must understand what they were fleeing from. The Roman Empire that had brought peace, prosperity, and urban civilization to Italy was dying. The Western Roman Empire, the half that controlled Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and Britain, was collapsing under the weight of economic crisis, military defeats, and barbarian invasions. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome, the first time in 800 years that foreign enemies had breached the city's walls. This psychological shock reverberated across Italy. The eternal city was not eternal. Nowhere was safe. Then came the Huns. In 452 AD, Attila led his forces into northeastern Italy. Cities fell one after another. Aquileia, one of the most important cities in northern Italy and a major Christian center, was besieged and destroyed. The population was massacred or enslaved. Padua, Altinum, Concordia, and other prosperous Roman cities in the Veneto region faced similar devastation. Refugees from these cities fled. Some went south, some went into the hills, and some, perhaps the most desperate or the most strategic, fled to the Venetian Lagoon. The lagoon was not empty wilderness. Fishermen had worked its waters. Salt workers had harvested salt from evaporation pans. Roman sources mention the lagoon's salt production as early as the 1st century AD. But it was not a place for permanent settlement. It was harsh, prone to flooding, infested with mosquitoes that spread malaria, and offered almost no agricultural land. But it had one critical advantage: it was defensible. The shallow, shifting channels and mudflats were nearly impossible for armies on horseback to navigate. Attackers would become lost, stuck, or ambushed. Only those who knew the lagoon's secrets could move safely through it. The situation grew worse. After a brief stabilization, Italy was devastated again during the Gothic War, 535–554 AD, when the Byzantine Empire attempted to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogothic kingdom. This 20-year conflict brought more destruction, famine, and plague. The final catastrophe came in 568 AD when the Lombards, a Germanic people, invaded Italy from the north. They conquered most of the peninsula quickly. The Lombard invasion was brutal and systematic. Cities fell. Roman administration collapsed. Survivors fled. Wave after wave of refugees came to the lagoon from Padua, from Altinum, from Concordia, from Oderzo, from Aquileia. They came not as conquerors or colonizers, but as terrified survivors seeking any refuge from the violence consuming their world. This was not a planned migration. This was desperation. The Venetian Lagoon became a city not because anyone wanted to live there, but because it was the only place barbarian armies couldn't follow. The lagoon geography of a refuge. The Venetian Lagoon that received these refugees was a harsh and complex environment. The lagoon stretched approximately 55 kilometers from north to south and varied from 8 to 14 kilometers from east to west, covering roughly 550 square kilometers. It was separated from the Adriatic Sea by a series of barrier islands and sandbars called lidi. Water flowed in and out through 3 main openings, tidal inlets, that connected the lagoon to the sea. The lagoon was shallow, much of it only 1 to 2 meters deep at high tide, with channels of varying depths winding through it. At low tide, vast mudflats were exposed. This tidal action was critical. It prevented the lagoon from becoming a stagnant swamp and provided some natural flushing of waste. Within the lagoon were approximately 120 small islands, some barely elevated sandbars, others slightly more substantial accumulations of silt and sediment. These islands were the only solid ground, and even they were barely above sea level. Most were marshy and prone to flooding at high tide or during storms. The environment was challenging in every way. Fresh water was scarce. The lagoon water was brackish, undrinkable. Rain collection in cisterns would become essential. The soil was poor, mostly sand and silt, and suitable for most agriculture. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in the marshes. Winters brought cold winds and flooding. Summers brought heat and stagnant water. But the military advantages were undeniable. The labyrinthine channels were constantly shifting with tidal action and seasonal changes. Only local inhabitants who lived on the water and learned the patterns could navigate safely. An invading army would become hopelessly lost, unable to move cavalry or heavy equipment through shallow water and mud. Ships from the open sea would run aground in the shallow waters. Small boats familiar with the channels could strike and retreat with impunity. The lagoon was a natural fortress that required no walls. The water itself was the defense. Early settlement. The first refugees. The refugees who arrived in the 5th and 6th centuries did not find an empty lagoon. Small fishing communities and salt workers already existed, descendants of people who had worked these waters for generations. But the influx of refugees transformed these scattered settlements into something more substantial. The newcomers were not peasants but urban Roman citizens of destroyed cities who brought literacy, organizational skills, craft knowledge, and the memory of Roman civilization. Settlement concentrated on the more stable islands. Torcello, in the northern lagoon, became one of the earliest major settlements. Refugees from Altinum fled there, bringing with them their bishop and the administrative structure of their destroyed city. By the 7th century, Torcello would have a cathedral, the Santa Maria Assunta, whose foundations date to 639 AD. Murano, now famous for glassmaking, was another early settlement site. Burano and Matsorbo in the northern lagoon also received refugees. The Rialto Islands, the cluster of small islands in the center of the lagoon that would eventually become the heart of Venice, were settled somewhat later, perhaps in the late 6th or early 7th century. These islands were marginally higher than the surrounding marshland, though still barely above sea level. Settlement was not unified. There was no city of Venice in the 5th through 7th centuries. Instead, the lagoon contained multiple independent communities, each centered on its own island or island cluster, each maintaining its own leadership, each connected to its refugee origins from different mainland cities. These communities were called tribunes, after the Roman administrative officials who led them. Each settlement maintained some connection to Roman governmental traditions, the memory of urban organization, legal procedures, and civic administration that refugees had carried with them. Building on mud architecture and engineering, the fundamental challenge facing the lagoon settlers was how to build on ground that wasn't really ground at all. Waterlogged mud and sand that couldn't support significant weight. The solution was wooden pilings, a technique that would define Venetian construction for the next 1500 years. Builders cut trees, primarily alder, oak, and larch from the mainland forests. These timbers were brought by boat to the building site. Using heavy mallets and pile-driving equipment, workers drove thousands of wooden stakes deep into the mud, down through the soft silt until they reached firmer clay layers beneath. The key to this technique's success was that the pilings remained constantly submerged in the oxygen-poor, salty water of the lagoon. In these anaerobic conditions, the wood did not rot. Submerged in water and mud, the wooden pilings could last for centuries, even millennia. Many buildings in modern Venice still rest on these ancient wooden foundations. On top of the pilings, builders constructed wooden platforms. On these platforms, they built structures, initially simple wooden buildings, but eventually incorporating stone and brick as the communities became more established and wealthy. The earliest buildings were modest single-story wooden structures with thatched roofs, using wattle and daub construction for walls. These buildings housed families, served as workshops, or functioned as storage for fishing equipment and salt. Churches were the first stone structures. The refugees brought their Christian faith with them, and building a church was a priority for each settlement. These early churches were simple structures: stone walls, wooden roofs, basic plans. But they represented permanence and community identity. The Church of Santa Maria Assunta on Torcello, founded in 639 AD, still stands, and is the oldest surviving building in the lagoon. Its original form was simpler than the current structure, but its foundation demonstrates the early commitment to building permanent religious structures, even in this challenging environment. Building materials had to be imported. Stone came from the mainland, transported by barge across the lagoon. Brick was manufactured from clay found in the lagoon area. Timber was continuously needed not just for pilings, but for construction, boats, and fuel. Population and social structure. The population of the early Venetian settlements is difficult to estimate precisely, but historical and archaeological evidence suggests modest numbers in the 5th through 7th centuries, growing significantly in the 8th century. Torcello, the largest early settlement, may have had several thousand inhabitants by the 7th century. Other island communities were smaller, hundreds rather than thousands. The total lagoon population in the 6th century was likely in the low tens of thousands, growing to perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 by the 8th century as the settlements consolidated and trading networks developed. The social structure reflected both Roman heritage and the realities of lagoon life. At the top were the tribunes, leaders of the individual island communities. These men were often descendants of the Roman landowners and officials who had fled the mainland. They maintained literacy, understood Roman law and administration, and provided leadership for their communities. The clergy formed another influential class. Bishops and priests who had fled with their congregations provided spiritual leadership and maintained connections to the broader Christian world. The Bishop of Olivola, later the Patriarch of Venice, became an important figure. Free landowners, those who owned boats, fishing equipment, or salt production facilities, formed a middle class. In the lagoon economy, boats and salt pans were the equivalent of land ownership in agricultural societies. Craftsmen included boat builders, net makers, fishermen, salt workers, carpenters, and others whose skills were essential to lagoon life. Slaves and the unfree existed in these early communities, though the nature and extent of unfree labor in early Venice is less well documented than in contemporary mainland societies. As Venice developed, slavery would become part of its economy, particularly in the form of enslaved people acquired through trade. Women's roles were essential. Women managed households, preserved fish, worked in salt production, spun and wove cloth, and likely participated in market trade. The harsh conditions of lagoon life required everyone's labor. Daily life survival in the lagoon. Daily life in the early Venetian settlements revolved around the fundamental challenge of survival in an environment that provided few natural resources. Most people woke at dawn, their lives governed by tides and daylight. The first task was often checking boats and fishing equipment. The lagoon's tides and storms could damage or displace essential tools. Fishing was the primary occupation and food source. The lagoon teemed with fish: mullet, sea bass, sole, eel, and numerous other species. Shellfish, mussels, clams, oysters were harvested from the mudflats at low tide. Fishing techniques included nets, traps, and lines. Knowledge of tidal patterns, seasonal fish movements, and lagoon channels was critical. Salt production was the second major economic activity. Salt pans, shallow pools where seawater was trapped and allowed to evaporate, produced salt crystals that were harvested, dried, and packaged for trade. This work was labor-intensive, seasonal, and required careful management of water levels and evaporation rates. Salt was valuable, essential for preserving food in the pre-refrigeration world, and became the foundation of Venetian trade. Food was limited and monotonous by modern standards. Fish, bread made from grain imported from the mainland, vegetables, cabbage, onions, beans grown on whatever patches of soil could be found or created, and preserved fish were dietary staples. Meat was rare. Wine was imported. Fresh water came from rainwater collected in cisterns, a complex system of filtration using sand and gravel to purify the water before storage in underground reservoirs. Boats were not luxuries but essential tools for survival. Every family needed access to a boat to fish, to travel between islands, to trade. Boat building was a critical craft, and boats ranged from small rowing boats to larger fishing vessels. Housing was modest wooden structures, single rooms or small houses, shared by extended families. Furnishings were minimal: sleeping pallets, storage chests, cooking equipment, fishing gear. Hearths provided heat and cooking capability, though fuel was scarce and had to be imported or scavenged. Sanitation was primitive. Human waste was dumped into the canals or lagoon, where tidal action provided some flushing. Disease was common: malaria from mosquitoes, dysentery from contaminated water, and periodic epidemics. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality high, the climate was harsh. Winter brought cold, damp conditions, flooding during storms, and constant wind. Summer brought heat, stagnant water, swarms of insects, and the ever-present smell of fish, salt, and mud. Yet the communities survived, adapted, and slowly prospered. Economy and trade: salt and Byzantium. The economy of early Venice was based on three foundations: fishing, salt production, and trade. Fishing provided immediate sustenance and local trade goods. Fresh fish could be sold to mainland communities. Preserved fish, salted, dried, or smoked, became a trade commodity. But salt was the key. The Venetian Lagoon's salt pans produced high-quality salt that was essential for preserving meat and fish across Europe. Salt production required minimal capital investment, just labor, shallow pools, and sunshine, but generated valuable trade goods. The lagoon settlers traded salt to the mainland in exchange for grain, wine, timber, metal goods, and other necessities they couldn't produce locally. This trade relationship was mutually beneficial. The mainland needed salt, the lagoon settlers needed food and materials. Venice's relationship with the Byzantine Empire was critical from the beginning. The lagoon settlements remained nominally under Byzantine sovereignty. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, still controlled parts of coastal Italy, including the Exarchate of Ravenna. Venice fell within the sphere of Byzantine influence. Byzantine connections brought advantages: trade access to Byzantine markets, and the wider Mediterranean political protection. Byzantine imperial authority provided a counterweight to Lombard pressure, cultural and religious ties to the Eastern Christian world. Legal traditions based on Roman law as codified in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Venetian merchants began to serve as intermediaries, buying goods from Byzantine territories and selling them to the Lombard-controlled Italian mainland, and vice versa. This position between Byzantine and Lombard spheres created commercial opportunities. By the 8th century, Venetian traders were venturing farther afield, to Constantinople, to the Adriatic coast, to the Byzantine territories in southern Italy. Ships from the lagoon carried salt, fish, and timber, and returned with grain, wine, silk, spices, and manufactured goods. This trade required ships capable of sea voyages, not just lagoon navigation. Venetian shipbuilding evolved to meet this need, developing vessels that could handle both the shallow lagoon and the open Adriatic. Political organization: the first doges. Political organization in the Venetian lagoon evolved gradually from the scattered, independent island communities to a more unified system. Initially, each island settlement had its own tribune or leader. These tribunes governed their communities independently, maintaining their own relationships with Byzantine authorities and managing local affairs. But external pressures and internal needs pushed toward greater unity. The Lombard threat required coordinated defense. Trade required unified commercial policies. Byzantine authorities preferred dealing with a single representative rather than dozens of separate communities. According to Venetian tradition, the first doge, the leader of a unified Venetian polity, was elected in 697 AD. His name was Pauluccio Anafesto, though some historians question whether this first doge was a later legend rather than historical fact. What is clear is that by the early 8th century, the lagoon settlements had adopted a unified political structure headed by a doge, from the Latin dux, meaning leader or duke. The doge was elected, not hereditary. This was a crucial distinction from contemporary political systems. While the early electoral process is not fully documented, it appears that the leading families and tribunes of the various lagoon communities selected the doge through some form of assembly or council. The doge's authority was limited by councils and the consent of the leading families. He was not an absolute monarch, but a chief magistrate presiding over the republic, though the term republic would not be formalized until later, representing Venice in dealings with Byzantine authorities, commanding military forces, and serving as the symbolic head of the unified lagoon communities. The doge resided initially on Malamaco, one of the Lidi barrier islands, which served as an early administrative center before power shifted to the Rialto Islands. The relationship with Byzantium remained important, but became increasingly autonomous. Venice sent tributes to Constantinople, recognized Byzantine suzerainty nominally, and benefited from Byzantine trading privileges. But in practice, Venice governed itself, made its own commercial decisions, and pursued its own interests. This quasi-independent status, nominally Byzantine but practically autonomous, characterized early Venetian politics and would continue for centuries. Religion and the church. The Christian church was central to Venetian identity from the beginning. The refugees who fled to the lagoon brought their faith and their clergy with them. Bishops who had led congregations in destroyed mainland cities re-established their authority in the lagoon settlements. The ecclesiastical structure was initially fragmented, mirroring the political fragmentation of the early settlements. Different islands had their own churches and clergy. The Bishop of Olivolo on the island that would become the Castello district became increasingly important, eventually becoming the Bishop of Venice, and later the Patriarch. But early Venetian ecclesiastical affairs were complicated by the ongoing conflict between the Patriarch of Grotto and the Patriarch of Aquileia. When Aquileia was destroyed by the Lombards, its Patriarch fled to Grotto on the lagoon's edge and claimed authority over the lagoon churches. This created a rival ecclesiastical authority that competed with other bishops. The church calendar structured life. Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, and numerous saints' feast days provided the rhythm of the year. These celebrations offered community cohesion, breaks from labor, and connections to the broader Christian world. Church buildings were the first permanent stone structures in each community, demonstrating religious priorities and the desire to establish continuity with the Roman Christian tradition. Venice's relationship with Rome, the papal seat, and Constantinople, the Byzantine Patriarch, was complex. Venice was geographically close to Rome, but politically and economically connected to Byzantium. This dual orientation would shape Venetian culture, Latin in language and Roman in church affiliation, but Byzantine in artistic style and political connections. Defense. Water as fortress. Venice's greatest defense was the lagoon itself. Traditional fortifications, walls, castles, towers were less important than knowledge of the channels, tides, and mudflats. The lagoon's complexity made it nearly impregnable to outsiders. When Pepin, king of the Franks and son of Charlemagne, attacked Venice in 810 AD, his forces became stuck in the shallow waters and were unable to reach the main settlements. Venetian boats harassed the Frankish forces, who eventually withdrew in failure. This victory demonstrated that the lagoon strategy worked. Venice was virtually unconquerable as long as it controlled the water. Military forces consisted primarily of armed men in boats. Venetians developed skills in naval warfare, using their intimate knowledge of the lagoon to ambush, outmaneuver, and defeat enemies. Small, fast boats could strike and retreat into channels too shallow for larger vessels to follow. The settlements maintained watchtowers on strategic islands and the Lidi to warn of approaching threats. Signal fires could alert the communities to danger, allowing time to prepare defenses or evacuate to deeper lagoon areas. As Venice grew wealthier, it began to build a fleet capable of operations beyond the lagoon galleys that could defend Venetian trading interests in the Adriatic and beyond. This transformation from defensive to offensive naval capability marked Venice's evolution from refugee settlement to maritime power, from refugees to Republic of Venice that exists today with its Grand Canal palaces. St. Mark's Basilica, an architectural splendor, bears little resemblance to the desperate refugee settlements of the 5th and 6th centuries. The early Venetians did not choose the lagoon because it was beautiful or advantageous. They chose it because they were fleeing for their lives from barbarian armies that had destroyed their cities and killed their families. The lagoon was a last resort, mudflats and marshes that no one else wanted, where survival meant learning to fish, produce salt, and build on pilings driven into mud. It was a place of mosquitoes, malaria, flooding, and constant struggle. But those refugees brought with them the memory of Roman civilization, literacy, administrative skills, legal traditions, and organizational capability. They didn't simply survive. They built institutions, established trade networks, and created a political system that would evolve into one of history's most successful republics. By the year 800 AD, Venice was no longer just a collection of refugee settlements. It was emerging as a maritime trading power, with a unified government under the Doge, commercial relationships spanning the Mediterranean, and a navy capable of defending its interests. The transformation from refugee camps to the Republic of Venice took centuries. The early period from roughly 400 to 800 AD was not glorious. It was survival, adaptation, and gradual development in one of the most challenging urban environments humans have ever attempted to inhabit. Standing in modern Venice, surrounded by Renaissance palaces and Byzantine mosaics, it's almost impossible to imagine the wooden platforms on mudflats, the salt workers and fishermen, the terrified refugees building homes on pilings because they had nowhere else to go. But that's where Venice began, not in beauty, but in desperation. Not as a planned city, but as a refuge. Not because anyone wanted to live there, but because it was the only place barbarian armies couldn't follow. Venice was built by refugees, and from that desperate beginning, they created something extraordinary.